Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for being here this evening. I understand that it is a very broad topic, and I also know that we can't begin a meeting today of the Human Rights Subcommittee without acknowledging the tremendous human rights abuses that are happening in Ukraine right now. I know there's a debate going on in the chamber at the moment, but I think that all of us here are very united in standing with Ukraine. I do want to ask some specific questions because I noted that all three of you have talked about particular geographic areas. But what I would like to know is I know that over the last decade or two, there have been significant advances in gender equality, in SRHR, and in alleviating sexual violence against women and girls around the world. There are still obviously, horrible conditions in certain places. But my question to you is, with the current backsliding of democracy and human rights, with the rise in authoritarianism that we're seeing around the world, and particularly, I'd like Ms. Nivea Bandi to start, mostly because she's a constituent of mine, but I'd like each of the witnesses to then step in. But I know, Ms. Nivea Bandi, you mentioned Tigray and the sexual violence that's happening against women and girls there. If you could perhaps comment on whether this is something that is increasing globally, whether there are areas in particular where this is a particular problem, and what is the state currently on sexual and reproductive rights of women and girls?
Thank you for that important question, Honorable Vanderberg. So yes, the short answer to your question is yes, women's rights have been backsliding. And what we notice is that wherever human rights in general are backsliding, then inevitably women's rights also backslide. And particularly in the context of armed conflict. So we know that sexual and gender-based violence is a weapon of war, and wherever there are armed conflicts, then there's a high likelihood of, or we can assume that there are women's rights are being violated, and particularly through sexual violence. So with the increase of armed conflict that we're seeing globally, we are definitely noticing an increasing trend, an increase towards violence towards women. I would add to that as authoritarianism and advances, and you have more challenges that are placed around democracy. At the same time, civil society organizations that advance women's rights also tend to be the most affected. I think all panelists have spoken about the risks that civil society faces in various countries. The large majority of names that you heard were male. What happens is that when those figures who normally enjoy a certain privilege because of their gender status are targeted, we can assume that women civil society leaders who are advancing this work are at an even greater risk. And we see that particularly in the African continent, and I would say in the Americas, where we have this staggering numbers of femicides that are increasing across the region. We're seeing a high number of women human rights defenders who were advancing sexual and reproductive rights being on the run. Likewise for LGBTQI plus defenders as well. And the numbers that we keep seeing are really, they're really staggering, particularly in the Americas, especially in Mexico, when we have a really high rate of femicide. So I would say, yes, this is a trend, and I think it's important that we constantly connect the two and understand that as rights are getting assaulted, then women's rights are definitely seeing a decrease as well. And I would just add, with the rise of a lot of far-right movements as well, we see this having a direct repercussions on women's rights globally.